Star Wars was one of the most groundbreaking movies ever made. Later dubbed A New Hope, Star Wars was a revolutionary film that reshaped the sci-fi and fantasy genres, launched the blockbuster era, and spawned an enduring franchise that has lasted almost 50 years. In this video, we're gonna dive deep into this film and its history 48 years after its release. We'll cover the historic production of the movie and how key decisions that were made led to the success of the film. We'll comb through the actual movie itself and why it resonated with audiences so much. We'll analyze the reception of the film, and I'll even go through a bonus section at the end of the video for you guys. So let's travel back in time to the early 70s and look at the production of the first Star Wars. For a film that has been out for almost 50 years now, there's only so much I can add to the conversation. Yeah, I can sit here and cover all the things you already know and make my own version of Empire of Dreams, a documentary, mind you, that was a big source for this video. So I want to dive a bit deeper than that. I really want to look at key decisions George Lucas made and key ideas he had that led to the overwhelming success of Star Wars. It should be noted, of course, that the reason Star Wars succeeded was for a multitude of reasons. But of these reasons, I want to point to one I feel was the most important reason behind the success of Star Wars, and it's not one that people often think about. Star Wars was so successful because of when the movie came out. Star Wars at its heart was a product of American culture in the 70s. Now, some people like to use this argument as a means to undermine George Lucas. Star Wars was only successful because Lucas was lucky enough to be born in the perfect time. That's nonsense. As you'll see in a second, Lucas's keen understanding of pop culture and Hollywood led him to making Star Wars. So in the earliest parts of the production, yeah, Lucas had his influences. Flash Gordon was the biggest one. Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress was a major influence some people seem to forget. And of course, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces led to the foundation for the structure of the film. But instead of focusing on these parts of Lucas's influences, let's look at the culture and cinema in the 1970s. The 70s were overall an uneasy time for Americans. The nation was divided because of the Vietnam War, trust in the government was at an all-time low with Watergate, and films often reflected this downbeat attitude from the early 70s. The result of all of this was that younger audiences were not interested in what Hollywood was putting out. In an attempt to save the future of the industry, Hollywood started to look at younger filmmakers and invest in them. Of course, during this time, George Lucas came along with his first feature film, THX 1138. Even though Lucas was proud of his work, no doubt, he noticed that younger audiences didn't care for the movie. Lucas wrote, "I realized after THX that people don't care about how the country's being ruined. All that movie did was make people more pessimistic, more depressed, and less willing to get involved in trying to make the world better. It's too easy to make films about Watergate, and it's hard to be optimistic when everything tells you to be pessimistic and cynical." Because of this growing sentiment Lucas started to realize, he created his own company, Lucasfilm Limited, and made American Graffiti. The reception of this film only further proved Lucas's point that more films needed to be made for younger people. Many people may not know this, but George Lucas was actually in the running to direct Apocalypse Now, but the studios turned him down. Because of this, Lucas decided to focus his efforts on Star Wars. I'd still like to make Apocalypse Now, it's something that needs to be said, but I think it's more positive and more helpful at this point if I continue to make Star Wars. We've got to regenerate optimism. Maybe kids will walk out of the film and for a second they'll feel we could really make something out of this country, or we could really make something out of our lives. So Lucas began making this science fantasy film that would hopefully leave an impression on younger audiences. When people look at Lucas's interest in Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, it wasn't just because Lucas happened to like the format of these stories. He was interested because Campbell had done research on what all these cultures and religions in the world had in common. They all shared this common myth. By implementing that into Star Wars, the story would be able to resonate with people outside America. It would resonate all over the world. Early on in the process of making Star Wars, before Lucas had a single presentable draft, Alan Ladd Jr. was interested in what George Lucas had to offer. He saw that attitude and spirit that Lucas possessed, and therefore he decided to invest in Lucas and sign him on to make Star Wars.
And he was able to say, I think this guy's talented, I think we're going to invest in him. So Alan Ladd Jr. invested in me. He did not invest in the movie. and it paid off.
A big part of the backstory to Star Wars were all the early drafts Lucas had written. Lucas's early drafts for Star Wars were really complex and also radically different from the Star Wars we know and love. I'm not going to read everything from these early drafts, but look at some of these concepts. Until the recent Great Rebellion, the Dai Nogas were the most feared warriors in the universe. One by one, they had been hunted down and destroyed as enemies of the new galactic kingdom by a ferocious and sinister rival warrior sect, the Legions of Latau. This draft also features characters like Justin Valor, Akira, and Bink. This was all from Lucas's first draft. Other drafts included General Luke Skywalker as he tries to protect the princess while they flee across the desert wastelands of Aquila in land speeders. The second draft supposedly didn't have any girls in it at all. Of course, these early drafts were different from each other. While characters and the Jedi and the Force changed from script to script, what never changed was this idea of a rebellion versus a galactic empire. Just because Lucas wanted his movie to be more optimistic, that didn't mean he wouldn't take influence from things like the Vietnam War. Technology against humanity was a big theme in some of these early drafts. So many little details about this movie stemmed from the current events of the 70s. But again, at the end of the day, Star Wars had to be positive. It had to inspire children. In Lucas's third draft, ideas and characters started to take shape. It wasn't until Lucas's fourth draft, however, where it started to become the Star Wars we know and love. Lucas was smart to make each draft more simple than the previous one. There's this narrative out there that people had to tell Lucas how insane his ideas were, and that's why each draft got progressively more simple. This isn't true. Lucas realized his drafts were too complex and he simplified it himself. If you look at the designs from the earliest bits of concept art from Colin Cantwell, you would notice how whack some of these ideas were. Grittiness and realism became really important to Lucas. As much as he loved 2001: A Space Odyssey, he always felt the film was too clean. Lucas said, "One thing I learned from Kurosawa is to try and instill an immaculate reality, an attention to detail that makes it real. Whether you've got dust or a rattling thing on the side of the ship, that adds another element to it that keeps it looking real. People think our places are real. There's never a sense of, oh, I'm watching a science fiction movie." Because of all this, Ralph McQuarrie was brought on to help design some of Lucas's concepts. His designs are what were used in the final film, and it helped Lucas pitch the film to 20th Century Fox. After draft after draft, Lucas was finally ready to make his movie. We all know some of the behind-the-scenes stories, like how Lucas didn't initially want Harrison Ford playing Han Solo because he was an American graffiti. What I found so interesting about the casting was how each actor somewhat resembled the role they were playing, and how that was important for Lucas. After the cast was finalized, filming began on location in Tunisia. My biggest takeaway from all these stories about the shooting of Star Wars was just how resilient George Lucas was. Shit in Tunisia was a disaster. Equipment failed, props were melting, R2 kept breaking down. At Elstree Studios, where most of the movie was filmed, shit got only worse. The entire crew had no faith in what Lucas was trying to make. Lucas would also often clash with people on his crew, like the cameramen, for example. Lucas was so stressed the entire time that the cast would go out of their way to try and make Lucas laugh.
We were all goofing around and trying to make George crack, because he really looked like he was ready to burst into tears, and you try and cheer him up.
And.
The mic was in frame.
The mic was in picture.
Lucas ended up having a panic attack where he was hospitalized with hypertension and exhaustion. Because so much extra time was needed, the film was delayed from Christmas 1976 to summer of 1977. I cannot imagine a more miserable production than that of Star Wars, but Lucas was so passionate about his vision that he endured. This wasn't just something Lucas wanted to make. Star Wars was something Lucas had to make. That passion from a filmmaker is once in a generation. The other interesting part of this production to consider are the budgetary constraints Lucas was under. Because Star Wars at the time was unproven, and that no one had faith in the project, Lucas didn't have as much of a budget as he would like. Lucas was only given $11 million to work with, which in today's money is like $57 million. Because his budget was so limited, Lucas had to condense a lot of his story. Many people probably didn't know this, but Alderaan was originally going to be a city in the clouds. Instead of Luke, Han, and Obi-Wan going to the Death Star where Leia would be rescued, it would all happen on this cloud city. But because of budgetary constraints, Lucas was forced to condense the story to have this prison sequence be on the Death Star. Throughout the actual production of the movie, so many locations were reused, especially on the Death Star. If you notice, a lot of these hallways are just the same hallway flipped around. During the trench run, many of these shots are simply reused, like this shot of Tarkin or this shot of a fighter entering the trench run. Speaking of the trench run, the entire sequence was trimmed down. Originally, Luke was going to have 2 trench runs, one where he failed, and then the second one would be the one where he succeeds. This was simply trimmed down just to make the ending shorter and to save time during production. There are also famous examples of certain scenes that were filmed but cut for budgetary reasons. A famous example being the Jabba scene. Lucas wanted there to be some animated creature over this fat dude, but there was simply no room for it in the budget. So eventually most of the important dialogue from this scene was given to Greedo, who was dubbed over with an alien language. Now there were very few of these changes that Lucas strongly opposed. In the special edition changes, the Jabba scene was something he added back into the movie, so this was always something he really wanted to be in the original film. But besides that, Lucas was malleable. He was willing to take feedback to make the movie better. There's another misconception about this film, and it's that Lucas's editors somehow saved the film from being destroyed by Lucas. Were these editors instrumental to the success of the movie? Absolutely. Was the first cut of the movie a disaster? Absolutely. But guess what? Pretty much every first cut of every movie is a disaster. And it's not like the editors went rogue, went against Lucas's wishes, and then made a better movie because of it. It was a collaborative process like most movies are. As I mentioned before, some scenes like the Jabba scenes were cut off, along with a lot of the big scenes. Initially, before production even began, Lucas wanted the beginning of the movie to only follow the droids. This was inspired by Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, but he took some advice from his friends and filmed these scenes of Luke at Tosche Station. Eventually, he went back to his gut and decided to remove the scenes entirely. One detail that definitely surprised me was that initially Obi-Wan wasn't supposed to die. Lucas said, "As I originally wrote it, Ben Kenobi and Vader had a sword fight, and Ben hits a door, and the door slams closed, and they all run away and Vader is left standing there with an egg on his face. This was dumb. It totally diminished any impact the Death Star had. I had been toying with the idea of killing Obi-Wan, but I made the final decision when we were in the desert." Lucas made that big of a change while they were filming the beginning of the movie, so some changes the editor suggested, and some changes Lucas suggested, and together they got the final version. So was the film saved in the edit? Yeah, but Lucas and his editors worked together to save the film. The film was arguably also saved by the VFX work as well, which Lucas was heavily a part of. If you want to try to take away any credit from Lucas, the person you should point to is John Williams, because his score was the final piece of the production. Once the VFX work and the score was finalized, that is when people were finally sold on the movie during these early screenings. Just like American Graffiti, test audiences loved the movies, but the executives hated it. So just days before the movie's release, Star Wars had finally wrapped post-production. Initially, the film was only set to be released in a handful of theaters. Lucas was so stressed out and so confident the movie would bomb, he and Steven Spielberg went on vacation to Hawaii so he could avoid all the critics. But Lucas couldn't be more wrong. The production of Star Wars is one of the most fascinating parts of this movie. Of course, so many people deserve credit for the success of the film, but no one more so than George Lucas. From the earliest stages of this production, we saw how it was Lucas's ideas for a more positive and uplifting film that resonated with audiences so much. Lucas saw what was going on in the early to mid 70s, and he wanted to make a change. Now, of course, just because Lucas had all these great ideas, that doesn't automatically mean the movie was gonna be good. So let's dive deep into the many facets of the story of Star Wars and see why it resonated with so many people. What made Star Wars so successful? What about this film resonated with fans so much it became the biggest blockbuster ever? Sure, the music was definitely a part of it. The visual effects were probably the biggest reason behind why the movie made so much money, but look at something like Avatar. The first movie came out 15 years ago and it's still the highest grossing movie ever made. The sequel also made a buttload of money, but as you've noticed, box office success doesn't necessarily correlate with cultural relevance. What made this film lead to the most beloved franchise ever made? This answer may sound anticlimactic, but honestly, Star Wars was so successful because of how simple it was. As we previously covered, during the 70s, Americans desperately needed a simple but effective story. A story where people could feel good about themselves. A story that didn't remind them of how corrupt their government was, or remind them of a war so many thought was unnecessary. People just wanted to have fun again in the theaters, and they got that with Star Wars. Luke Skywalker was a quintessential hero who followed the hero's journey. He was just a farm boy, he had a call to adventure, and he saved the day in the end. There was the scoundrel, the pirate who had the coolest ship and the coolest sidekick. He went on a simple arc of learning to fight for a cause larger than himself. There was the old wizard who had the cool sword and mentored the hero. There was the Dark Lord who also had a cool sword and had really cool armor as well. With all these characters, there's nothing really unique about them. They were standard mythological characters. By the way, this is not a criticism at all. This is again a praise of George Lucas. He knew this movie didn't need to be complicated, and it wasn't. The only character who wasn't typical was Leia. Sure, she was the princess, and sure, she needed to be rescued, but come on, we know Leia's no ordinary princess. The way Lucas speaks about Leia is so unique and so different from any of these other fairy tales. Lucas once told Carrie Fisher, "Leia is the leader. She is the key character. You're a 19-year-old senator. You kick butt every day. You can shoot. You can fly. You're smart. These two guys are goofuses. They don't know anything. You're in this rebellion. They're not. You're in charge of everything. So stand up straight." Lucas's approach to Leia was, of course, another big reason this film was successful, especially since Leia ended up becoming a major feminist icon in the 70s and 80s. The simple good versus evil tale was something that resonated with a lot of viewers back then. It was really the cultural change that Lucas always wanted it to be. Now, Lucas didn't always intend on Star Wars being so simple. Obviously, as we covered with the old drafts, we saw how complex they were. Lucas was a deep thinker who had a lot of ideas he wanted to incorporate into Star Wars, but he showed restraint. It's been documented how Lucas had a vast vision for Star Wars. Not just a single movie, not just a single trilogy, but apparently an entire 9-movie saga. Some accounts say it would have been 12 movies. This is why Lucas was so protective of making the sequels. He didn't care how much money he was going to make. All he wanted from the studios was the rights to the merchandise and the sequels. Because he gained the rights to the sequels, he didn't need to incorporate all his ideas right away. There's one quote that really stood out to me. Lucas said, "I believe if people believe that they're good and they see good examples of what it is, then they have a tendency to become good and be good. It's what the churches teach, but churches have the same problem as politicians. They preach the right ideas but become corrupt. They become the bad guys because of greed and fear and selfishness." Obviously, the first part of this quote resembles a lot of what I've already spoken about, but the second part about churches is really interesting. None of that is in this first film, but 48 years later, we can clearly see how this theme made its way into the prequels. The point I'm trying to make is that Lucas didn't try to squeeze every philosophical idea he had into this first movie. If he did that, the movie would be way too cluttered and wouldn't resonate with audiences. Also, Lucas knew that talking about corrupt institutions was not something people wanted to hear in 1977, so he showed restraint and saved those ideas for another day. You can see this throughout so much of the early drafts. Some of these early drafts mention the Dark Lords of the Sith, but the word Sith is never mentioned throughout the entire original trilogy. Vader and Palpatine are just dark side Force users. Lucas knew he had to keep these films simple, and it worked. Now, I'm not trying to sell the movie short. I'm not saying it's only great because of its simplicity. Its greatness, again, is a rich tapestry. The effects, the music, the simplicity, the time period, that's all a part of it. But the movie is actually a great film. It's not a simple, mediocre film that was popular. While the character arcs and the overall plot are relatively simple, the film is masterfully paced. The movie moves quickly, but not quick enough to lose the audience. You can have a simple movie or a really complex movie. It's pacing, however, that brings people back into the theaters, and that's why it made so much money. I don't know if there's a term out there to describe the structure of this movie, but the term I previously used when describing other stories is the tree branch approach. I coined this term when talking about Amazon's The Rings of Power. In the first episode, and I'm not going to go into spoilers, we meet Galadriel. A few minutes later, we cut away to another character and his storyline. Then we cut away to a third character and his storyline. Then we cut away to a fourth character and her storyline. The Rings of Power takes the opposite approach switch to this tree branch approach. If you map out the main characters and their storylines, they're introduced all over the place. There is no structure. You can get away with this if you're telling some ordinary run-of-the-mill story, but if you're telling a science fiction or fantasy story, you need to be extra careful. Since you need to do more world building and other stuff that comes along with science fiction or fantasy, you don't want to confuse your viewers. You don't want to overwhelm them with information, or else they'll lose interest. With A New Hope, if you were to map out the storylines, every character and every concept and every storyline can be drawn back to a single point, aka the beginning of the film. It's like a tree branch. You start from one place, and then every part of your story branches out from there. The movie begins and we see spaceships. After a few seconds, we cut to the inside of the ship where we see two robots. Okay, these two robots are our POV characters. Every storyline and every character stems back to 3PO and R2. These droids end up meeting Leia. Through Leia, we meet Darth Vader. Through Darth Vader, we meet other Imperial officers. Through Vader and Leia, we meet Grand Moff Tarkin. If we rewind a bit, once the droids leave the ship and crash on Tatooine, we meet Luke. Through Luke, we meet Obi-Wan. Through Luke and Obi-Wan, we meet Han and Chewbacca. Through Han Solo, we meet Greedo. Eventually, all these stories come together. In a fantasy story, it's crucial to have these POV characters so we don't become lost in what's going on. When we first meet Luke, it's not from his perspective. It's from the perspective of the droids. Through the droids, we learn a little bit about Luke. Once we're comfortable with him, then we get scenes from his perspective. We learn a little bit more about the academy, his aunt and uncle, the farm, all of it. Whenever we're introduced to something new in this story, it's always from the perspective of a character that doesn't have a full understanding of what's going on. This way, the audience can easily put themselves in the shoes of the POV character and learn about the world that way. Almost all the great science fiction and fantasy stories begin this way. Game of Thrones, for the most part, begins this way. Lord of the Rings begins this way. Avatar: The Last Airbender begins this way. Watching the first Star Wars movie, it's almost impossible to get lost because Lucas structured this film in a way that allows the viewers to perfectly understand what's going on. It's also not just the structure that makes this effective, but the way Lucas presents information. For a fantasy movie, Star Wars doesn't need that much explaining to do, and that's quite rare. Most of the movie is pretty self-explanatory. There's an empire, there's a rebellion, there's a farmer, there's a wizard, there's a princess. There's not much here that's too confusing. There's only really two scenes that have heavy world-building exposition. The scene where Obi-Wan tells Luke about the Force, and then the conference scene where the Imperials talk about the Death Star, the plans, and the Senate. This is another example of Lucas showing restraint. Sometimes you don't need to do the most complicated world building. Lucas didn't feel the need to develop the Jawas. Do that in a spin-off show about a Mandalorian. He didn't feel the need to develop the Tusken Raiders. Do that in a spin-off show about Boba Fett. Lucas didn't feel the need to develop the Sith. Do that in the prequels. Lucas did such a great job at making it feel like there's a world outside of what we see on the screen. And that is something that is so hard to accomplish in a fantasy movie, but Lucas did that. Remember how earlier in the video I mentioned that there were these scenes of Luke that were deleted? There's actually 3 of them, and all of them take place before we meet him in the Jawa scene, which is the scene where we meet him for the first time in the final cut of the movie. Initially, the way the movie begins is that we see the opening, we follow the droids around briefly, and then we cut to this random farm boy on the planet below. For a few scenes, we follow him around, and we cut back and forth between Luke and the droids until they meet each other. If these scenes remained in the movie probably still does well. They're not awful scenes per se. I do think they slow the pacing down a bit, and what's accomplished here is accomplished later on, so they're a bit redundant, but Lucas was wise to cut these scenes out of the movie, because if they made it to the final cut, then you're breaking this tree branch approach that I've spoken about. You're following the droids, and then you cut away to following this new character, instead of meeting Luke through the POV of the droids. I wouldn't go as far as saying audiences would have been overwhelmed with information because these scenes aren't complicated at all, really. They do, however, break the masterful structure of the final film. I have a funny story I want to tell. Back in high school, I dated this girl, and she had never seen Star Wars. I know, how could the gold man date someone like that? This was in 2017, so Rogue One had just came out. I thought to myself, why not just show her Rogue One first, and then we can watch the original trilogy. Rogue One was a newer film, it had great effects, maybe it would be easier to digest than a film from the 70s. Boy, was I wrong. She was pretty confused most of the movie. This is because Rogue One is a terrible movie if it's your first Star Wars movie. The pacing of the movie is rough for the first half, you're thrown from character to character, and it's quite hard to follow if you know nothing about Star Wars. So we then watched A New Hope, and things were a lot easier for her to understand. Frankly, A New Hope, The Phantom Menace, and even The Force Awakens are all pretty decent starting off points for the Star Wars franchise. You may like some of these movies more than others, you may frankly even hate one of these movies and refuse to call it canon, but all three of them do a decent job at holding your hand and introducing you to the Star Wars universe. This was a model started by A New Hope, and it did it excellently. So because of its pacing and its simplicity, A New Hope was really easy to follow and people loved it. Now, a big criticism I often get of these years later videos is that I don't often reflect on how the movie has changed in the years since its release. Honestly, that's a fair critique. So let's focus on exactly how the perspective of this film has changed in the nearly 50 years it's been out. You may not have known this, but Star Wars has released a lot of content since this movie came out. Some would argue too much content. This may be a hot take. Sure, Star Wars under Disney has a lot of issues, but honestly, I think Disney has made this film better, at least in terms of its placement in the Star Wars canon. One thing Lucasfilm has really emphasized since owning the franchise is how big of an event the Battle of Yavin really was. If you look at the wider canon, the Rebels destroying the Death Star was a huge deal. It was the first time people felt like the Empire could actually be defeated. You don't really get that vibe in The Empire Strikes Back. The movie says destroying the Death Star was important, but it begins with the Rebels still in hiding as if nothing happened. The new canon has done so much development on not only making the destruction of the Death Star a big deal, but also showing how improbable this victory was for the rebellion. First, they created a whole spin-off movie devoted to expanding one of the paragraphs of the opening crawl. Rogue One added so much weight to the Rebels stealing the plans. It puts into perspective how much sacrifice was made by the Rebels just to put Luke in this position. Then what they did was make a spin-off series to that spin-off movie that only further develops the rebellion, and/or shows how much work went into creating this rebellion and how hard it was. The animated show Star Wars Rebels shows us the earliest parts of the rebellion, even hinting at the construction of the Death Star. Of course, when I watch A New Hope, I don't always think to myself, wow, all these other stories have made this movie better. But as someone who is invested in the wider canon and how these stories all connect together, I'm glad that these subsequent stories don't shy away from how important destroying the Death Star was. This next point people are going to hate me for making, but honestly, the Obi-Wan show makes me enjoy this movie more. The show is not perfect, obviously, but sue me, it added more weight behind Vader and Obi-Wan's confrontation. Sure, I could have died happy thinking that Mustafar was the last time these two saw each other, but I like the context added from the Obi-Wan show. I get it's because of the order these movies were filmed in, but this moment being the first time Obi-Wan sees Vader again always felt a bit anticlimactic to me. I love that Obi-Wan got his emotional moment with Anakin before he could finally make peace. So like Rogue One, sure, it doesn't change my opinion of the movie, but when I watch it now thinking about the wider canon, I do think about the Obi-Wan show in a good way. Where Disney kinda does diminish the movie is with the subsequent Death Star knockoffs. I never liked that there was a second Death Star in Return of the Jedi. I always thought that was such a lazy choice by Lucas. The Force Awakens having Starkiller Base is way worse, but nothing compares to how idiotic the Death Star destroyers from The Rise of Skywalker were. So knowing that this Death Star is technically the weakest superweapon in Star Wars is not a fun thing to think about. 1977 Star Wars is one of the most important films ever made. Sure, it's not the deepest or most thought-provoking film, but there was so much brilliance that went into the story of this film that it's no surprise it became the monster hit it ended up being. And since then, the Star Wars brand has only continued to make me appreciate this film. Now, before covering the reception of the film, I want to cover one more aspect about it. Since we're discussing this film nearly 48 years after its initial release, it's only fair that we cover the re-releases of this film. That's right, let's dive deep into the special edition of Star Wars: A New Hope. Since 2015, the controversy of the special editions has severely died down. Back then, before The Force Awakens, this was the peak of the Star Wars drama. It was popular to hate on George Lucas back then because people didn't like the prequels, so they totally ripped on the special editions as well. I've always been a bit mixed on the changes. Some of them I think are terrible, and some of them I think make the movies better. I've always believed that it's criminal that Lucas wouldn't release an updated version of the theatrical cuts, but it is what it is. Instead of covering every single change made, made, I'm just gonna cover the broad changes that were made. There's 4 categories of changes I'm going to cover. There's the expansion and enhancement of existing shots, there's added CGI elements, there's the reintroduction of deleted scenes, and then there's the miscellaneous changes. Of this first category, most of these enhanced shots I really like. This includes expanding the scenery of some shots, like R2 strolling through the desert, wide shots of Obi-Wan's home, and the wide shots of Mos Eisley. They're not overwhelming differences, but they subtly enhance the movie. The changes made some shots in space look much better as well, so these CGI changes I quite like. The added rings on the explosion are a non-factor to me at all, but overall, these changes are changes I quite like and should be included in a special edition of a movie. The changes that are awful are all the major CGI assets added to certain scenes. A famous example is the rock added in front of R2. This one I don't care for, but it's so funny to me that Lucas really wanted to add a rock in front of R2. These added shots of the dewbacks and the stormtroopers are awful. The CGI here simply looks terrible. There's not a single effect in the prequels that looks anywhere near as bad as this. The worst offense, however, has to go to the sequence where Luke and Obi-Wan enter Mos Eisley. Why Lucas felt the need to add all this crap to the movie is something I'll never understand. The one specific shot that really pisses me off is when this giant monster or whatever walks directly in front of the frame as Luke's speeder is pulling up. This one always feels like a big F you to me personally. The CGI of Jabba looked so bad when it first came out in 1997, but at least it looks much better in the 2011 version. When the special editions added CGI to space sequences like the Battle of Yavin, it works nicely. When CGI is added to create creatures, it often looks terrible. Now, in the 1997 version, 3 new scenes were added to the movie, scenes that were previously deleted scenes. One is, of course, the Jabba scene, another is this really quick sequence of Luke and Obi-Wan walking through Mos Eisley, and the last is Luke meeting up with Biggs on Yavin. This Luke and Obi-Wan sequence is whatever, I have no opinion on it. The Biggs scene is fine, but it's awkwardly placed. In the theatrical cut, Biggs is mentioned once in a throwaway line in the beginning of the movie, so it's strange to bring this little sequence back. The reason this scene was filmed was because Lucas originally had the scenes of Biggs and Luke in the beginning of the movie, and it would make sense for them to have a little reunion once they're both with the rebellion. But since that beginning scene was never added back, including this scene feels out of place. The Jabba scene I don't like. For one, Jabba's introduction in Return of the Jedi is leagues better than this scene. Also, as we covered back during the production, the information here is already covered in the Greedo scene, so it makes the scene feel redundant. You can just tell that this scene was filmed with another human being instead of a giant alien puppet. The animation of Han walking over Jabba's tail is awful, but also hearing Han call Jabba a wonderful human being always takes me out of the movie. Now, there are some other changes that don't fall into any of these categories. There's the change to Obi-Wan's yell when we first meet him. I do not like this yell in the special edition. It sounds nothing like a giant monster. But of course, we can't conclude this section without talking about the most controversial special edition change of the entire trilogy. You know what I'm talking about, the change to make Greedo shoot first. On its own, I don't care for the change. Sure, I think it's silly that Lucas felt the need to change this, but compared to the trash-ass CGI brought into this movie, Greedo shooting first is a minor inconvenience. What I find so fascinating is that this sequence has been changed with literally every version of A New Hope. Originally, Greedo never shot. Then in 1997, Greedo obviously shot first. In 2004 and then in 2011, they made it seem like the two shoot at the same time, or at least really close. When Disney brought the franchise, I think we thought that was going to be it. No more changes, but there was still one last change.
McClunky.
This isn't even a change to the shooting of Greedo. It's just an extra second they threw into the movie. I'm a huge McClunky fan. This is maybe the stupidest special edition change, but it's so stupid I can't help but love it. I'm gonna do something fun. For each of these original trilogy movies, I'm gonna give an award to the best special edition change and the worst special edition change. In A New Hope, the best special edition change goes to the improvements to the X-Wings. I think a lot of these shots look much better, and it definitely makes the final battle more enjoyable. The worst special edition change award goes to the giant dewback walking in front of the screen. This one always pisses me off. Of all the films in the original trilogy, A New Hope is the one that was altered the most by these special editions, and that's unfortunate. Let's wrap up the video by taking a brief look at the reception of Star Wars. Obviously, the film was an incredible success, but how successful was it? As of today, Star Wars A New Hope has grossed $775 million worldwide. This is in large part due to the special edition re-release. In its initial run, the film grossed just under $600 million worldwide. At least domestically, Star Wars was the highest grossing movie of 1977 by a mile, so much so that it more than comfortably doubled the film in second place. Adjusted for domestic inflation, the original Star Wars is the second highest grossing movie of all time, behind only Gone with the Wind. That's an amazing statistic. When it comes to the ratings, A New Hope has scored a 93% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 96% audience score. This makes A New Hope the second highest rated Star Wars movie on Rotten Tomatoes. On IMDb, the film scored an 8.6 out of 10, which, like Rotten Tomatoes, makes it the second highest rated Star Wars movie. But that also makes it the 29th best movie ever made, according to IMDb. What do you guys think about the very first Star Wars? Let me know down below. Tune back in a couple days to see me cover The Empire Strikes Back, so stay tuned for that. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to thank the Clot Squad, and I will see you guys next time.